Why don't we begin this evening? First of all, thank you for joining us this evening. My name is David Staley. I'm on faculty in the History Department and director of the Goldberg Center, our digital public history center at the university. And this lecture series is titled the Clio Society. It was a name and idea that was spawned by one of our alumni, actually two of our alumni, Steve Millett and Craig Zimfer, neither of whom could be here this evening, and usually they're the ones who would be introducing the event this evening. The Clio Society, from our website, promotes the lifelong learning of history for personal enrichment, engages students, colleagues, and friends in an exchange of information and ideas about history outside the realm of traditional academic classes and seminars, and builds a social network of students, colleagues, and friends who share a common interest in history and provides a sustained, broad-based support to the History Department. In fact, I see the Clio Society lectures as evidence of our commitment to public engagement for our research to have an impact beyond the walls of this university. I'm very glad that you're here this evening. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Scott Levi, who joined our department in 2008. He's a specialist in the socioeconomic history of early modern Central Asia. In addition to numerous journal articles, book chapters, other publications, he has written or edited 3 books and has recently published Caravans, Indian Merchants on the Silk Road, in just this past January from Penguin. That forms the basis of his talk this evening. He was a founding member of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies and indeed wrote The Long Struggle for Women's Rights in Afghanistan for one of our publications, Origins, Current Events and Historical Perspective. He wrote that in 2009. And I always take the opportunity during Clio Society events to draw your attention to our monthly e-magazine, Origins, Current Events and Historical Perspective. If you go to origins.osu.edu, please, it's a free publication. And it does, what the name implies. It's a monthly publication that explores current events in a deeper, wider historical context or historical perspective. And we were, of course, delighted that Scott was able to write for us. Professor Levi was the recipient of the 2011 OSU Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching. And I think after you hear him this evening, you'll understand why he received that award. He is, of course, one of our best teachers. Join me, please, in welcoming Professor Scott Levi.
Thank you all very much for taking some time on a Thursday evening. It is a great pleasure to be here among some great friends, some who I haven't seen in too long, and some who I will be dearly missing before too long. The Silk Road lives again. We have a new Silk Road. Let me start with a little contemporary words for a historical talk. This new Silk Road is not an exotic relic of Orientalist imagination. The Chinese President Xi Jinping launched a new Silk Road economic belt back in September of 2013. He did so in Astana, Kazakhstan. This is a very, very real Trans-Eurasian Railroad line, nearly half again longer than the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It connects China directly with Spain. En route, it crosses Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, Poland, Germany, and France. It's fast, and it's able to carry very large loads. On November 18, 2014, a Chinese train began moving westward along this corridor, carrying 82 containers of merchandise totaling more than 1,000 tons. The train reached Madrid on December 9th, traveling 13,000 kilometers in only 3 weeks. This represents for China a major global shift away from maritime trade and toward overland networks for reasons that we'll be discussing in a little bit. China aims to improve this by developing high-speed train networks in the future, cutting travel time from Beijing to Moscow, for example, from just under a week to 33 hours, and extending outward from this main corridor to develop new networks that cut across Central Asia and make it elsewhere, including South Asia. In fact, at the same time as we have seen this monumental undertaking coming out of China, we see another one, the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Hailed as an unprecedented integration of South Asia into the Silk Road network. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor travels down the Karakoram Highway all of the way to Gwadar, Balochistan. Gwadar was built in 2007. Here's an image of it as it currently is. And it is now set to be expanded considerably. China, in the CPEC initiative, is dedicating $45 billion for infrastructure and energy projects across Pakistan. $45 billion. China has several strategic motivations in this initiative. One is to improve geopolitical relationships with Pakistan, outspending the United States. Number two, obviously, to move Chinese goods into the international markets. Number three, to move oil from the Gulf to China. Right? And here, let me show another. Sorry. There's another map to make the cut. Moving good oil from the Gulf up to China using a route other than the maritime route, which goes through the Straits of Malacca, which is a vulnerable position. We'll see this again in a little while. Finding an alternate route going northward from Pakistan. Fourth, bringing more development money into Xinjiang, China. Why development in Xinjiang? This is a region that is home to a large population of Uyghurs, Turkic Muslims. It is a region that has seen considerable political unrest in the past, especially the past decade, but really you can say over the past 20 years. There are risks within Xinjiang of the rise of a Taliban-style movement in the region, and this is an effort to stem the growth of these kinds of political movements. So the CPEC initiative is remarkable. $45 billion in infrastructure development in Pakistan, but it is, as we will discuss, hardly unprecedented. So let me introduce myself just a little bit. David was very generous, I think, but let me give you a little bit of the deep background in how I got to this project. So my name is Scott Levi, and I am an early modern Central Asian historian. If that sounds like the first step in a 12-step program, probably it should. You know, hi, my name is Scott. Hi, Scott. But I grew up in Iowa, in the Midwest. So being here in Columbus is it's very comfortable for me. This is a nice home. And for those of us who are from the Midwest, we know that it is a wonderful place with great educational infrastructures. And when one grows up and realizes that the world is so much bigger than one's backyard, one wants to go out and venture and see some of that. So I made my way as an undergraduate to Uttar Pradesh, Mussoorie, India, on my first study abroad program, studying Hindi in North India. Foothills of the Himalayas was gorgeous, and I was hooked. After I graduated, I went on another study abroad program. This time, in 1991 and 92, I went to Lahore, Pakistan, for an Urdu language program. So I was there for 6 months. 1981-92 was a really interesting time, as they say, may you live in interesting times. A number of things were happening around the globe, not the least of which was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So as I was living in Pakistan, I was trying as much as possible to pay attention to what was happening around me. I had never really heard of the Central Asian countries. It was all part of, when I was in high school, the pink blob that was the Soviet Union, which consisted of, I knew Russia and I knew Ukraine, and then there were a bunch of other countries. But the rest of it didn't quite gel. Now, suddenly, in the fall of 1991, there was Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. I had no idea. But I started to pay attention. And as I was walking through the airport in Islamabad one day, I think it was probably November or December of '91, I saw a banner flying under or right above the entrance, pale green and blue with white background, and lettering saying Uzbekistan Hava Yolara, Uzbekistan Airways. I'd never heard of Uzbekistan, but announcing this new inaugural flight between Islamabad and the capital of this new Central Asian Republic, Tashkent. Now Tashkent sounded to me like, I mean, if I was in Pakistan, this was cool. Oh, it was comfortable. It's a convenient place to live. I have wonderful friends who were there, but I was hooked. I started reading more and paying closer attention to these Central Asian peoples and studying the historical relationship between South Asia and Central Asia. Right? So as I was taking my language classes, I was finding in the Urdu language all sorts of vocabulary coming from Central Asia. Turkic vocabulary making its way into South Asian languages, including the word Urdu itself is a Turkic word. Right? Religiously, I was encountering all of these different strands of Islamic mysticism and influences from Central Asia that were practiced at the local level across Pakistan, Sufism and such, the Naqshbandi order and all sorts of different kinds of things. The Mughal emperors, the famed Mughal emperors of early modern South Asia, of early modern India, I found were from Central Asia. Babur, the founder of the dynasty, was born in the territory that is now Uzbekistan, in the city of Andijan in the Fergana Valley. So I found that there was a long legacy of Turco-Afghan invaders making their way down into South Asia. Right? So these and the image that I found as I was reading this historiography, the historical literature on the subject, was that the relationship between India and Central Asia was unidirectional. All of these influences coming from Central Asia, invading India, passive India, aggressive Central Asia, and it was all moving southward, and there was nothing happening the other direction. And I thought that sounded like a load of crap. I thought, you know, it's not how human societies work. There are, I hypothesized that there would be interactions, that there would be some kind of an Indian influence going the other direction. What it was, I didn't know. But that was my hypothesis. And with that thought, I started my graduate program at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I'll refrain from saying anything positive about such an institution.
Thank you.
Right here at the Ohio Union. Bite my tongue. It was a wonderful place to do a PhD also. I started studying the languages that one has to study in order to do dissertation research in Central Asia. These languages include, I had been studying Hindi and Urdu, which I found completely useless for that particular project. That was a shame. It was a good experience anyways, but rather you need Persian, Farsi, for the historical records. If one is going to go to Tashkent, Uzbekistan, it is good to know Uzbek. And as I found on my first initial trip to the archives, a 1-month inaugural trip just to kind of get a sense of what awaited me, I found that all of the really great literature and the catalogs in the archives were all in Russian. So if you really want to, no problem, come on in. If you really want to be able to delve into early modern Central Asian history, you've got to have all three of these. And then, of course, there's the English that you got to have as well. Still working on that. So I had a pretty full plate during my graduate program, and I'm looking back and seeing a few of my graduate students, and they have the same full plates now. But it was exciting. I got involved. I studied the languages. I had summer intensive language programs. I did study abroad programs. So lots of traveling, meeting lots of wonderful people, many of whom are still very, very good friends. And I prepared myself to go to Central Asia to find Indians. And so I did. So that's the deep background to this project. Today's talk pulls from several strands of my research. Some of these are behind me, some are ongoing. But I would like to take the opportunity to address, now actually showed on purpose, my new book, Caravans, published with Penguin. I published my first book, my revised dissertation, which we'll talk about in more detail later on, in 2002. That book came out with E.J. Brill, and at the time it was selling for, I believe, $126. I'm very happy to say that as of this morning, Caravans, Indian Merchants on the Silk Road, can be yours for the low, low price of $7.11. That was a major coup. It is eminently assignable. This is that was one great objective. The book itself is a distilled, rewritten, and updated version of my earlier work on the Indian merchant diaspora in Central Asia. And here's the thing, you know, I researched that book in the 1990s. I published that book in 2002. It's now 2015, and over the years I have rethought, reconsidered a number of aspects of my argument. There were some parts that I thought I really wanted to bolster, other parts that I thought really weren't as relevant, perhaps, as I thought back in the day. So this was a great opportunity for me to come back to that original research and update it in a much more accessible way. So this one's also, it's written for a more popular audience. Now, I'd like to start today with a current research question that pertains to the Silk Road. The Silk Road is a defining feature of Central Asian historiography, and it's one that I argue needs to be reconsidered. I've touched on this a little bit before in some of my earlier work, but now I'm, I would say, plowing into it with considerably more force. Then we'll move on to Caravans and how it addresses the Silk Road, and we'll highlight some elements of what's new in that book. So as we get into this, let me dust off a vignette from a talk that I gave some years ago. Let's go back just a little more than 600 years, back to 1402. The Central Asian conqueror Tamerlane's armies had defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara. At the time, the Spanish King Henry had 2 ambassadors in Ottoman territories. These 2 ambassadors returned to Spain, reporting to King Henry that they had been treated well. King Henry sent in another ambassador named Ruy González de Clavijo all of the way to Tamerlane's capital of Samarkand. Over the years 1403 and 1404, Ruy González traveled to Samarkand and back at the very end of Timur's life. And he left us an effusive report of Tamerlane's wealth. Samarkand being a great city, a wonderful commercial center. At the turn of the 15th century, nobody doubted the centrality of Central Asia. Move forward a century to 1498, to the end of the 15th century, I should say, and Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and made his way to Calicut, photo of Samarkand here, as we see in some color photos from 1905, and then a more recent one that I took just a few years ago, Samarkand today. 1498, sorry, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and made his way to Calicut. The 16th century is dominated by the expansion of the Portuguese Estado da India across the Indian Ocean, connecting Portugal with new Portuguese territory in Brazil, with the Indian Ocean commercial economy. In the 17th century, the Portuguese were joined by, and then superseded by, the Dutch and English East India companies. And so the theory goes that early modern Asian trade shifted from overland routes, the Silk Road trade routes, to maritime trade. Central Asia's great historic Silk Road trade is said to have come to an end. Central Asia then fell into a long, protracted period of isolation and decline, from which it was brought back only in the 19th century by Russian colonial expansion. So what I've just given is, I would say it's a streamlined, simplified and streamlined portrait of the historiography of early modern Central Asia. Some of my colleagues over the last couple of decades have argued that the region was pushed to the margins of world history, isolated up until the Russian colonial period. Others have argued that it was transferred, or that it transitioned from an active phase to a passive phase. There's also debate about the periodization of this decline. Some say that Central Asia was isolated during the full early modern period. Others say that it began in the 17th century, or really not until the beginning of the 18th century. But virtually all of the contributors to this historiography link Central Asian economic decline to the Indian Ocean maritime trade. That's a notion that is more than a century old. In fact, you could say here's a nice couple of statues of Tamerlane. As we say in Uzbekistan, Buyuk Babamiz, our great ancestor, our great forefather. So here, on horseback, situated in the main center of Tashkent, the capital, where once stood Karl Marx. The concept of the Silk Road dates back to 1877. It was advanced by a German geographer, Ferdinand von Richthofen, in his publication titled China. The orange line that we see here on the map outlines what has been accepted as the Silk Road. Now, to look more closely, the orange line, in fact, outlines the route taken by the agent of a 1st century Phoenician silk merchant. So one individual is said to have followed that particular route on his way from the Near East, the Mediterranean, all of the way over to China and back. It's one individual whose account we have. Over time, as the notion of the Silk Road has become more popular, Richthofen's nuances have been lost. It's what I like to refer to in classes with my students as the stupidification of an otherwise nuanced idea, as the nuance was lost, and we are left with an image of the Silk Road like this. A pre-modern superhighway, I-70, running right across Central Asia. Skirting the Taklamakan Desert, we know there were cities on the north, cities on the south. Nobody ever entered the Taklamakan. The name Taklamakan actually is Turkic for that which goes in doesn't come out, so we know that's to be true. But here we have the oversimplified version. The standard narrative of the Silk Road, as it's kind of come down to us over the years, is that the Han dynasty, Han China, extended their control westward from their capital at Xi'an, through the Gansu corridor, there to the north and west, around the Tarim Basin of the Taklamakan Desert, in the year 133 BC. We know that there was a terrific Han victory over the Xiongnu in that period, and all that territory became Han, and the Han went to work establishing garrisons and protecting commercial traffic across that territory. We see in subsequent centuries that after the Han victory over the Xiongnu, we get wonderful travel accounts, such as those of Fa Xian in the 5th century and Xuanzang in the 7th century, and other Chinese travelers, famous Chinese pilgrims, primarily Buddhist pilgrims making their way to India in search of Buddhist relics and religious texts. So we have these wonderful historical sources. And that the notion then is that this continued right up until the year 1498. This is the standard kind of pat narrative of Silk Road history, 133 to 1498. And in fact, right here at the Ohio State University, we have a course on the books, which is the Silk Road, from the 200 BCE instead of 133, but right up until 1498. And that is there, I publicly announce, only until I can change it. We'll have to make a few adjustments over time. So the notion of what this Silk Road is and what constitutes the Silk Road does start to get a little bit more complicated. We know that, for example, that Buddhism is established in South Asia. Siddhartha Gautama lives from 563 to 483 BCE, at least that's our best estimate. And sometime in the centuries after that, Buddhism makes its way out of South Asia, into Central Asia, and then travels eastward into China, where it finds a receptive audience. So we need to have an off-ramp for our trade route. We must have an off-ramp. We know that travelers are coming from India to Central Asia in this period. There's been a long tradition of directing attention to the transmission of Buddhism along the Silk Road. Buddhist caves in Dunhuang, for example, a wonderful tourist location. Here's some wonderful images of art and architecture, Buddhist statues, the cave temples and such, located in northwestern China. Here's a couple of images that I took myself. A Buddhist stupa dating to approximately 2,000 years ago that is being excavated, or at least it was a few years ago, being excavated right outside of the city Termez in Uzbekistan. Very close, in fact extremely close, this is the Amu Darya River here, to the border with Afghanistan. This sign right here says, Tokhta Dawlat Chekase, or stop, you have reached the end of your country. National border would probably be better. I thought the irony of this was that we have what appears to be an electrified fence. I didn't touch it to find out. A Buddhist stupa, and in the background of the stupa, here you see the stupa's outline, we have missile targeting radar that are scanning the skies across Afghanistan. I think the Buddha would not approve. So we have Buddhism actually emanating out of South Asia in multiple different ways, multiple trajectories, is my point. Lots of attention to this. At the same time, very little attention to the commercial infrastructure that everybody recognizes is propelling this exchange. So we have romanticized understandings of these caravan peddlers, these long camel caravans making their way out of, whether it's from China to the Mediterranean or from India up to Balk, where they meet up with the caravans coming from China. And we find these peddlers, turban-wrapped, dusty, bearded men, daggers all over them, very well-protected, hardy guys who are making their way the full distance from Xi'an all the way to maybe Damascus or Aleppo, where they get where they're going and they unload the camels and they take out their razor-sharp daggers and slice open the bales to the packages to display these amazing silks that are coming all of the way from China to the Mediterranean. They sell it, they load up with gold, and they make their way back home, and they just keep going back and forth. This is, again, a simplified image of the Silk Road trade. Highly oversimplified, and we're going to work to add quite a bit of nuance to that here in just a little bit. As these notions of the Silk Road trade are being developed, we also, from the late 19th century, have a school of Russian Orientalists who is beginning work on Central Asian history. The first, you could say, air quotes around it, Western scholarly treatments of Central Asian historiography. This is a topic that's actually hotly debated right now. We don't have much time to get into this debate, this discussion. But let me introduce the greatest of these, Vasily Bartold. Bartold is recognized universally recognized as the founding father of Central Asian history. And on the one hand, one has to give him credit for trying to use modern methodologies to study Central Asian history. In his time, writing in the late 19th, early 20th century, he was endeavoring to use modern methodologies at a time when people had, the study of Central Asian history had been dominated by racist works by lay scholars and other works by colonial soldiers. So he's really trying to bring to bear the cutting-edge scholarship of Europe to Central Asian history at the time. On the other hand, we have to recognize that he and his colleagues were products of their time, which is to say they were writing in the late 19th century, in the 20th century, during the Age of Empire. They were employing cutting-edge social science theories of that period. These are theories by individuals such as Lewis Henry Morgan, who died in 1881 and is credited with devising the unilineal theory of social evolution, the notion that technological advancement determines civilizational hierarchies. Another is Herbert Spencer, who coined the term survival of the fittest, which became applied to human societies as social Darwinism. meaning if you can't defend yourself, you will become extinct. This gives rise to Rudyard Kipling's famous white man's burden. All of these theories are employed to explain and justify the colonial enterprise. Barthold himself unapologetically, boldly viewed Russia as a benevolent and modernizing force. He envisioned early modern Central Asia as isolated, backward, and in decline. And here we see several quotes from Barthold himself that give some insights into his scholarship. Identifying the 18th century as a period of political, economical, and cultural decadence for all of Muslim Asia, and noting that in the 19th century, when Europe definitely assumed cultural leadership, Turkestan stood lowest of all Muslim lands on the cultural scale, being as it was the part of Muslim Asia farthest removed from Europe. These ideas in the late 19th century were the foundational building blocks of the narrative, in the narrative of Central Asian history. Time and again, they've been reified in the historical literature, and at the same time, they've been grafted into the Silk Road narrative. Right? So here I want to pull these two narratives together. The notion of what the Silk Road is, and the way that Central Asia fits into that Silk Road paradigm. What I hope to do is to demonstrate how this understanding of the Silk Road has misshaped Central Asian history. Trade was the engine for the Silk Road exchange. I don't argue that. Collapse in this trade is considered the causal factor behind Central Asia's early modern decline. And this decline precipitated and justified Russian colonial expansion in the region. What I'd like to do now is very briefly show that because the Silk Road is poorly understood as a commercial network, it has also been quite malleable as a concept. It is often misused and twisted, which makes it somewhat difficult to challenge this received wisdom. And it's that challenge that I'm taking on in my next work. Let's turn to three, very quickly, just we'll survey three very recent works by senior scholars in the field engaging the Silk Road. First, we have Christopher Beckwith, professor of Central Asian history, specialist in medieval Tibet. Published this work, Empires of the Silk Road, in 2009. So, to some extent, I have to credit Beckwith with writing a monumental study of Eurasian history with Central Asia at the heart of it. Nobody has achieved that, I think, for a good 95 years since Rene Doucet's great Empires of the Steppes. Beckwith, I think, rightly points out that Central Asian nomads were much more than barbarians. I don't just think that. I'm an adherent to the same perspective. Central Asian history is often written based on primary sources that are penned in the sedentary societies, which gives one a perspective, a skewed perspective of Central Asian history itself. At the same time, I have to take great issue with Beckwith's interpretations of the early modern period. And here I'll just read the bottom one, the bottom quote. Central Eurasia suffered from the most severe, long-lasting economic depression in world history. It declined into oblivion while the coastal regions of Eurasia, nurtured by the commercially minded European navies, prospered as they never had before. Here he's taking Barthold's position and actually strengthening it, rather than trying to problematize it and think that, and consider that there may be issues that need to be revised. Second, we'll point to Frederick Starr's recent book, 2013. The objective of Starr's book, Lost Enlightenment, is to examine Central Asia's medieval luminaries who flourished in the Abbasid period, so the high medieval period in the Islamic Middle East. And here we have some wonderful individuals. Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, the Prince of Physicians, magnificent scholar. Al-Biruni, who himself traveled to India, actually at the very beginning of the 11th century, famous as famous for a number of things, but famous as an astronomer, who advanced a heliocentric cosmology 500 years before Copernicus. Al-Khwarizmi, whose name is anglicized as Algorithm, Al-Khwarizm, algorithm, a mathematician, whose book Algebra Al-Jabr, actually we know as algebra, the algebraic sciences. Al-Farabi, a political philosopher, some wonderful, wonderful scholars. Like Beckwith, Starr emphasizes the magnitude of Central Asia's Silk Road trade. He suggests that a caravan of roughly 1,000 camels passing through Central Asia would be equivalent to approximately a 10 to 12 car freight train, able to carry as much as 500,000 pounds of merchandise, roughly 250 tons. Recalling our earlier discussion of this new Silk Road, we estimated that that first train making its way from China all of the way to Spain carried about 1,000 tons. So we're talking a number of 1,000 camels carrying a load equal to about a quarter of what that new 21st century train is able to carry. Now, of course, the train is much, much faster. And I'm sure it spits quite a bit less as well. Any of you who've spent time around camels know what I'm talking about. But it's pretty substantial in any event. Starr seeks to emphasize that the caravan traders would be predisposed to load their camels with luxury goods, such as silks and spices, not bulk goods, as they would be able to profit more richly from the luxury goods. And then he discusses the cause of this decline. So for Starr, the cause of the decline of the Silk Road was not Vasco da Gama. Rather, it was overtaxation in the 10th century. And Starr writes this advocating for a free trade policy across the region, kind of a Central Asian version of NAFTA. Some insight into this position can be gleaned from reading the blurbs on the back cover of the book, where one finds a very laudatory note by Francis Fukuyama, who wrote The End of History, and then also Henry Kissinger. That was an novel. Yeah, that was an novel. But in any event, we get from these two scholars, two senior figures in the field, we get two extremely different visions of the Silk Road trade. Both are convinced that the Silk Road trade was substantial. In fact, it was so substantial that it was sufficient to bring great prosperity to the region. Both use the Silk Road as major building blocks in constructing their arguments. For Beckwith, the Silk Road made Central Asia the linchpin in Eurasian history. Eurasian peoples prospered so long as there was a strong Central Asian nomadic state to mediate Eurasian trade. As soon as, whether it be the Chinese or the Romans, somebody upset this balance, then the entire Eurasian landmass fell into decay, into decline, until a new Central Asian state could reemerge and restore the balance. For Starr, Central Asia was, the Silk Road was able to give, enabled Central Asia to give rise to the greatest thinkers in the medieval world. Both argue that the Silk Road came to an end. And both argue that when it ended, that end sent the region into decline. They disagree about when, and they disagree about why. And I'll note that neither of them gives any evidence or meaningful analysis as to what constitutes the Silk Road trade. One cannot find footnotes in support of these estimates. Let's move on to a third study. Valerie Hanson. I'll show a picture of her book here in a moment. Valerie Hanson's recent book gives us it's called the Silk Road, A New History. Gives us by far the most rigorous and evidence-based analysis of the three that we're discussing today. Hanson relies heavily on the Sogdian letters. The Sogdian letters were penned in the 4th century, and a number of other primary source documents. These Sogdian letters were excavated by Sir Aurel Stein and Sven Hayden and other scholar explorers, scholar adventurers in the early 20th century. These guys were running around these various locations, skirting the Taklamakan Desert, digging in the desert and gathering enormous amounts of material, which they then loaded onto camel caravans and gradually made their way to Europe, whether it be to Sweden or to the British Library, where you could find all sorts of things that Aurel Stein brought back. Hanson uses these materials. I'll give you an example of one right here. Here is one of the Sogdian letters. This was one of 8 letters found in an abandoned mailbag labeled "Bound for SummerCon." I've had the same label put on my shirt before in the past as well. Here's just an excerpt from this, and I'm quoting Hanson's work, page 112. The letters, which date to 313 or 314, mention specific commodities: wool and linen, musk, lead-based cosmetics, ceruse, pepper, silver, and possibly silk. The quantities are not large, ranging from 3.3 pounds to 88 pounds, all consonant with small-scale trade managed by caravaneers. Hanson presents an image that contrasts sharply from the other two. She argues that the Silk Road was little more than a network of local roads. There was no pre-modern superhighway, and I completely agree with her. There were no long trains of camel caravans loaded with luxury goods, and here we get into a little bit of a dispute. For her, the Central Asian trade, the Silk Road trade, was just small-time peddlers moving merchandise from one town to the next. So now let me draw attention to a problem of conflation. Here's a quote from Hanson. The Silk Road was one of the least traveled routes in human history, and possibly not worth studying if tonnage carried traffic or the number of travelers at any time were the sole measure of a given route's significance. Completely polar opposite from Beckwith and Starr. Could not be more different. This problem of conflation helps us to explain this contrast. On the one hand, there is a tendency among scholars of the Silk Road to privilege China's westward trade through Central Asia. On the other hand, scholars have been using the Silk Road as shorthand for all Central Asian trade. And the result is, as I argue, the result has been a Sino-centric distortion of Central Asian history. Central Asia then being reduced economically to an appendage of Chinese history. So what I am advocating for is to shift the center of gravity to the west, away from China, albeit though recognizing that China is huge. It has, an immense population and an enormous economy, but that aside, in order to understand the magnitude of the Silk Road, we have to appreciate the diversity of the Silk Road, the multiple groups orchestrating multiple overlapping networks extending in all directions. Here we have state actors, nomadic intermediaries, merchant diasporas, and local peddlers. We have Chinese soldiers and other soldiers. We have diplomatic discourse and so many other things. And I argue that any commercial history of the Silk Road must integrate them all. We must also stretch long before the Han and long after 1498, which is why I will change the title of that course. It may take me a couple of years to get through the curriculum, but I'll be around to do that. So I think that such a study promises to shed new light on early modern Central Asian history, providing valuable insight into the histories of China, Russia, and also India. I argue that it promises to replace reified images of a static, isolated, early modern Central Asia with an emphasis on dynamism and integration. And my thesis, my central thesis that I think I would say runs through all of my work, from my first book through the most recent and my work in the future as well, is that it was integration, not isolation, that propelled early modern Central Asian history. What do I mean by integration? That merits a detailed answer. So first, let's turn now to another related matter. Here's a friendlier version of what I would argue constitutes the Silk Road, although this I would say still only outlines main trade routes. My first book. Engaged, as I approached it, as I crafted this, was designed to engage 3 key debates as I went off to Central Asia. This looks great, doesn't it? Bukhara, beautiful, beautiful city. This is where I lived. Actually, this building right here, I lived right up in there. One summer. I've lived in many different places across town, but that was a particularly horrific one. 22nd floor. and the elevator broke on the day I was moving out. All suitcases. Never forget it. So 3 debates. First, I argued that Central Asia was not economically isolated from its neighbors. Second, I argued that Indo-Central Asian relations were not unidirectional. And third, I argued that caravan traders were not limited to the peddler trade, which is to say they did much more than just buy cheap, transport far, and sell dear. They were doing much more than just that. So with that in mind, I packed my bags and moved to Tashkent and returned 6 times and gradually pieced together an understanding of an Indian merchant diaspora. That was the first book, which now I have, again, revised, updated, distilled, and rewritten for a popular audience. And let me just highlight briefly a few parts of the study, and we'll wrap up with that. There are several parts to the study. First is the emergence of the diaspora in the middle of the 16th century. I looked through a wide variety of historical records, legal records, chronicles, all sorts of different kinds of things, looking for evidence of Indian communities in Central Asia. And I found evidence of Multanis, individuals identified as Multanis, dating back as early as 1556. I found others in 1558, 1561, but nothing prior to that. I could find the odd link of Indian merchant caravans, but nothing that gave a sense of a semi-permanent diaspora community. Middle of the 16th century, the very moment when Christopher Beckwith hypothesizes that Central Asia is falling into abject decline and isolation is when we see Central Asia and India growing closer than the two had ever been before. I find evidence of the dispersion of this diaspora. From here we see the city of Multan. Later they moved to Shikarpur over the course of the 18th century. But from here, across the region, and here's a highlighted location where I was able to find various Indian merchant communities in the region. So in the 16th century, I find evidence of a few, in Bukhara, in Tashkent, in some of the larger cities. In the 17th century, the diaspora mushroomed. One Bukharan Khan wrote a mandate referring to Hindus living in, he says, Bukhara, Balkh, Badakhshan, Kunduz, Taliban, Aibek, Huri, Baghlan, Chabrahan, Tirmiz, Samarkand, Nasr, Kish, Shahrisabz, and wherever else they may live. So 2 things. First, Kish and Shahrisabz actually are the same city. I don't know why that was apparently a mistake in the original. And secondly, wherever else they may live, apparently the scribe's hand was getting tired. There were more in Afghanistan, Iran, and the Caucasus, up the Volga in Russia. They made their way as far as Moscow and Petersburg. One guy went to petition and was given permission to make it all of the way up to Arkhangelsk in far, far northern Russia. From there, he wanted to go to Germany. This was a diaspora that knew no limits. The broad survey of sources led me to estimate that in the 17th century, there was about 35,000 of these Indian merchants occupying communities across this diaspora. Another important contribution of the work, or at least I think, is the analysis of the Indians' commercial organization. As I said, these individuals were not peddlers. They were agents of numerous heavily capitalized caste-based family firms. Even prior to the English East India Company, 1600, even prior to 1600, these portfolio capitalists had been extending their networks across South Asia. And I argue it is precisely because of the influx of New World silver and the intensification of the 16th century Indian economy that these venture capitalists, decided to diversify their portfolios geographically, taking advantage of less competitive markets outside of the subcontinent. As the Indian economy was becoming more intensified, more competitive, they saw opportunities elsewhere, a variety of opportunities, and we'll talk about some of them. The study also notes that the Indians' primary commercial activities involved trans-regional trade and money lending. So they are they are operating trans-regional trade networks, and they are also operating large-scale money lending networks. And The trade, the merchandise, is primarily Indian cotton textiles, also dyes. We see large numbers of slaves, and especially in the earlier years, and other goods that are being exported to Central Asia. And the merchandise that's coming back southward is principally horses, Central Asian horses. And the estimates here come up to as high as 100,000 a year, making their way overland through the Khyber Pass. The system that the Indians operate worked like this. Directors at these family firms, venture capitalists, trained agents, exclusively male agents, in things such as various types of partnerships, legal issues, accounting techniques, methods for calculating interest, methods for issuing hundis, which are bills of exchange, which can be used to transfer large amounts of money across great distances very safely, rather than cash. The agents were then capitalized with commodities, so with goods, principally cotton textiles, bulk goods, not luxury goods, bulk goods. They, agents traveled to terminal destinations, such as these caravanserais that we see right here, by caravan. It would take several months to arrive at their location. They would reach their caravans, and they would caravanserais, and they would begin to sell their merchandise slowly. Each caravan brought large amounts of merchandise, and these individuals were trained to sell their commodities in order to keep the value of the textiles as high as possible rather than flood the market. They would sell it piece by piece, and as they would sell the merchandise, the money that would be brought into their hands then was issued as cash for high-interest short-term loans. Actually, two types of loans. One is high-interest short-term, loans of like 8 to 10 weeks for quite high returns. Also, we see historical documents that talk about the Indians who, as they would leave town twice a year, in the spring and in the fall, where they would go to the agricultural countryside and fund agricultural production, acting like farmers' state banks, making loans in cash or in kind to farmers, and then purchasing, or I should say, taking a percentage of the harvest as their compensation, and commonly purchasing the remainder for cash, monetizing local economies across the countryside, which facilitates taxation in cash. They were doing this in India, they were doing it in Central Asia as well. All right. This gives us some insight into why the local rulers really liked these guys, despite the fact that the vast majority of them are Hindus living in what is stereotypically a pretty conservative Islamic community. And so we see certain images. Some of these are great. Here we have the Brahmins, or a Brahmin, I should say. Here's another image of a Brahmin. But we have musicians. These are some wonderful 19th century photos of the Indians of Bukhara. Here, this one is the one I wanted to show you, all with their hookahs. As they were permitted to smoke in their caravanserai, and I don't know what they're smoking. Don't ask, don't tell. But smoking was illegal in Bukhara. So they're actually, the reason for this shot is that they're showing off that they had permission to do this within their caravanserai. The cremation ceremony. Occasionally, one of these guys would actually die. It was a rotating population of individuals, but occasionally somebody would die while off in Central Asia. According to Islamic traditions, the body should be buried. According to Hindu traditions, the body should be cremated and the ashes should be taken home and deposited in the Ganges. Images such as this exist. What we don't see, although from what we have in our descriptions of these events, there would have been a contingent of Bukharan soldiers. The soldiers, the state soldiers, would have been there to protect the ceremony. So they were clearly appreciated by the state. In fact, here's one 17th century, I'm just wrapping up here, David. One 17th century farman, different part of the same farman that I was reading earlier, actually. We are thinking about the condition of the greater community of people, those of other religions, Hindus, or Indians, obey the farmans that we make and help us very much. For this reason, we will weaken the grip of those who try to oppress them. The goods and property of these people should not become ruined. They are protected. Their protection will come from here, and their aspirations should be directed to Bukhara. That's in the 17th century. Now, moving forward to the 19th century, Josiah Harlan, and if any of you are familiar with who he is, or aren't familiar, he's the inspiration for the Sean Connery character in The Man Who Would Be King. Real character. But he made his way through Central Asia and says, later in the 19th century, wherever there is a bazaar, Hindus are a necessary part of the establishment. These people are always found amongst the buyers and sellers in all the cities of Central Asia and constitute the bankers and money changers in all commercial communities there. They form an indispensable part of the population. All financial affairs are entrusted to their management. And we can see the same among Indian communities in Afghanistan and in parts of Iran. Indeed, the largest of these Indian merchant diaspora communities was in Isfahan, the capital of Safavid Iran, where estimates run as high as 12,000 just in Isfahan, 20,000 across all of the Safavid territories. Again, in the 17th century. So, the role of the state in promoting this trade, in promoting long-distance commercial relationships across the Eastern Islamic world is something that I have further developed in the Caravans book. I've expanded that discussion as a collaborative effort with colleagues at the Institute of History in Tashkent, working on diplomatic letters and correspondence between various ruling nobility across the region. The study then continues on my own study and describes various factors surrounding the decline of this Persian diaspora in their respective societies and their various locations. And it's different historical processes that affect them in Russia versus Central Asia versus Xinjiang, China, where there was also a small, several hundred Indian merchants, and in Iran, where there was a devastation, a pogrom, to use the Yiddish, against the Indians, after which they returned and in a different form. Highlight just a couple of conclusions from the study. First, Central Asia and India were far more closely bound than we had previously appreciated throughout the early modern period. Second, this commercial relationship was indeed not just defined by caravan trade. It involved an elaborate network of circulating people and wealth. Indian merchants linked early modern Central Asia with the Indian Ocean economy, and through that with the global economy of the early modern period. So in some important ways, you could say that Indian capital fueled the Central Asian agrarian economy. Third, I would argue that the Silk Road didn't begin in the Han period, and it didn't end in 1498, hence the title of the book, Indian Merchants on the Silk Road. And finally, I'll note that this new Silk Road that we're talking about today is considered in context, in some ways, back to business as usual. That it's, the exception is various parts of the 20th century when borders were closed. By and large, the normative dynamic of overland Central Asia's role in overland Eurasian trade is as an integrative body within the heart of Eurasia. So the new Silk Road, new it may be with trains instead of camel caravans, but it is also just as old as camel caravans themselves.
I assume you're open to answering
From anybody except for you, David.
That's fine.
All right. Do you have a question, David?
Possibly.
No, I'm happy to answer questions. I'll do my best. If I can't, I'll make something up. Yeah.
In addition to the Indian communities, for instance, did you find Han-Chinese or other groups that were also merchant groups traveling, living in these areas?
Yes. You do find evidence of, depends where you're looking. All right, so from a Bukharan-centric perspective, like putting ourselves kind of in the heart of sedentary Central Asia, there are references to caravans coming from China into Xinjiang. So you don't really see, I wouldn't say you see a Han Chinese diaspora population in Bukhara, but you certainly see a presence. It's mediated by local peoples. When we talk about the Silk Road Exchange, the notion that you have like a Marco Polo making his way regularly from China to the Mediterranean and back, I mean, that's truly exceptional. Almost all of this is from one regional market into another regional market and then gradually making its way farther on. Now, you do see other communities that are there, commercial communities. The Armenians, for example, had a vaulted position in Safavid, Iran. They worked closely with the Safavid government. There was an Armenian merchant diaspora out of the New Julfa suburb in Isfahan that emanated northward through the Caucasus up to Astrakhan, where you have Indian, Armenian, and also Bukharan commercial houses. They call them a devor. It's like a caravanserai with the Russian version. You have Armenian communities in Bukhara and across much of Central Asia as well. You have Jewish networks also. So you see some. And the early modern integration, when I talk about the Bukharan network, I mean the Bukharan community in Astrakhan, this is actually where I am in my research right now for the next book, is to examine just how extensive these Central Asian early modern networks were. So here we have a study of an Indian early modern network finding its way into Central Asia, but what about the Bukharans? How far did they go? And what we find is from the late 16th century, or actually they're in Siberia in the 16th century, but from the late 17th century through the 18th century, they're very active mediating Qing Chinese trade with Tsarist Russia across Siberia in the north, as well as down in India and elsewhere. So there are many different groups that we're talking about here. I've highlighted one for this particular study.
Would you say that was population-wise the largest group? Was the Indian merchant diaspora? Or more Indians than Armenians or Jews or other groups?
Yeah. There's a large Jewish population in various parts of Central Asia, but only a part of them were actually trans-regional merchants. Whereas the Indians, this was the reason why they were there.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. The Armenians were much smaller in number, but very interesting. Yes?
You mentioned the role of the state, but you sort of just kind of slid past it very quickly and didn't really delve a little bit. But I'm curious, what was the role of the state? I mean, I'm imagining there was some attempt to support the development of different kinds of commodities in Central Asia that could be traded back and forth. But
That's right.
But it's unclear. But you know, I would like to know a little bit more about that.
So I'm glad you asked that, because there's some really wonderful historical records that illustrate these issues. Diplomatic discourse, diplomatic exchanges between, say, the Mughal emperors and the Uzbek Khans in Bukhara. And the exchanges begin in the second half of the 16th century, during the period when Akbar was on the throne in India. There's evidence, I mean, Akbar begins in 1556, and we have evidence of these Multanis up in Central Asia already at that time. At that point in time, Akbar was very young. I can't remember exactly what his age was in 1556, but he was very young, too young certainly to be given credit for mobilizing this in a period of a few months from ascending the throne. So we see an appreciation developing already in that context. The role of the state is to primarily to protect the trade routes, to invest in infrastructure. This was something that even before Akbar, the Afghan Suri, who were Sher Shah Suri, in the 1540s, had an amazing amount of work building little way stations along the way, planting trees, clearing roads. So Akbar, I think, really inherited that kind of tradition from an opponent and used it to flourish. With Akbar, there is one of the natures of this exchange is that the Uzbek Khans are always asking for specific goods, specific items that are necessary in the market. The Indian market, everybody knows what the Indians need, and that's horses. But the Central Asian letters actually actually specify specific commodities. We need textiles, is what you usually see. You have letters that are written on behalf of merchants traveling through their territories. So an Iraqi merchant from Baghdad makes his way to Bukhara and then gets a letter of introduction, which he shows as he passes in from Uzbek territory into Mughal territory. And then he is given a particular favorable tax rate. So protecting trade routes, building infrastructure, ensuring, and there's been much more work on the Mughal side of this than on the Uzbek side, but ensuring that there's a commercial economy across India that's actually producing the kinds of cash crop materials, cash goods, that are in demand, whether it's by the Portuguese or later by the other customers, right, the British and the Dutch, and also by the Safavids and the Uzbeks. So encouraging farmers to produce the kinds of things that need to be produced for these, managing an actual imperial economy. How's that? Yes.
I also had a question about the state, and that is, you seem to indicate that the state was often protecting the foreign merchant communities from the local population. What were the sources of the friction? Religious, commercial?
So yes, the sources of the friction could be religious. And here we have some, we turn to literary sources that talk about things such as there's a tradition in Central Asia. I've seen this in a few places, including a museum in Khiva, where there was a tradition of the forlorn youth who's fallen in love with this woman or man, who needs to somehow buy the favor of the beloved. And how do you get the money that you need to get the gifts that you need to impress the one that you love the most? Well, you rob an Indian merchant. Right? So, I mean, there's notions that they have all of this wealth. They have access to it, right? They've got it. They are draconian usurers. Right? There was no, they were there for business. They were described as being very, very serious, all business the whole time that they're in Central Asia, except for occasionally when you would have holidays, Diwali, right? You've got the wonderful colors. And then we get stories of drinking, which is haram in Islamic society, and other drug use, which people start to use to create ill feelings about the Indian community. So they needed protection. They needed protection. At the same time, what the services they provided, the regional economy, or the state economy in Central Asia, were deemed to be important enough that the state was willing to step in. There are only a couple of instances, and not in Central Asia, where the state deliberately targeted the Indian communities. The most famous is in Iran, as I referred to. 1722, the Ghilzai Afghans invaded Isfahan and targeted the Multani community, the Indian community. It was a devastation. That was made worse only by Nadir Shah, the general, the Safavid general, who ended up ending the Safavid dynasty and then installing himself as the next ruler.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is about the impact of or the role of the Safavid Central Asia relationships. We know that something kind of distinction politically and also ideologically happened between the Sunni and Shia, and we had a range of wars between the Safavid and Uzbek. I wonder if there was any impact in this situation over that trade between India and Central Asia. And the second question is about the other side. We have information about the Central Asian merchants or caravans in India also.
Yeah. So the first one, looking at the sources, my impression is that they're actually deceptive. And the deception is this, that it appears that there are two different networks emanating out of Multan. One goes northward through Kabul, Balkh, up to Bukhara, and emanates northward from there, across that region. Another goes westward through Kandahar, Herat, Mashhad into Isfahan, and extends this way up to Astrakhan. And so the impression is that you have actually two separate networks and that there's no communication between them. Now, I have a number of colleagues again in Central Asia. Muldana Tanieva is one. She spent a semester here a few years ago, before we joined us, who is doing work on 18th and 19th century overland trade through Karshi, Central Asian trade with Iran. So it seems we don't have much in terms of the written sources, but we need to make what we can out of what we are able to gain access to. But it looks as though actually the connection between communities, maybe not states, but communities between these two regions was much closer than people had appreciated, at least up until later in the 19th century when the slave raiding becomes exacerbated. Or so makes travel across this zone much more difficult. Right? The second question, the caravans coming from Central Asia southward. Yeah, that's another part of the story, and we do have ample evidence of Central Asian caravans making their way southward to India. Not just Bukharan merchants, where the Bukharans had these communities in what is today Pakistan and North India. They were smaller than the Multani Shikarpur communities that we talk about in Central Asia, but they were there. But you also, again, back to the question about the Han-Chinese trade with Xinjiang at this time, you have an amazing mediatory trade across Afghanistan that's being operated by the Afghans. These nomadic communities who have multiple homes, 2 homes. They winter in the south, down as far south as the Deccan Plateau, and they summer to the north, around the Shahrisabz Kish area and Karshi. And they're moving merchandise and they're moving animals, both directions. So the trade between the two economies is, again, mediated in multiple ways. Right? So you can't just point to the Bukharans and say that's it. You have to look at various aspects of the commercial economy.
So, one of the things you're talking about is that these Multanis are sojourning for some period of time, right?
Right.
Do you have a sense of what age they are? Is there a sort of prescribed age you should make this voyage? How long should you stay? Are they married?
That's a big question. I love that question. That's good. Yeah. So usually the model is, gathering a whole bunch of different materials. It looks like these guys are usually gone for about between 6 and 7 years. It's like the average. Sometimes 3 years. Sometimes 40 years. I suppose it depends how much you like life. But which I'm leading to right. It depends how much profit one is able to achieve in a particular location. So usually it is a young man who is kind of mid-teens back in Multan is being apprenticed. And then by the time the individual hits 18 to 20 years old or so, trustworthy enough to send off to a distant location, trained in languages and all of the various commercial accounting and such that I mentioned earlier. The accounts that we have indicate that by and large they are married by the time they leave. So they have wives and some have children who are back in India. And now we get to the bookkeeping matter of this, right? There's a big book where this individual has a wife and family who need income while he is away for a long period of time. So there is a stipend that is given over to the family from director. And there's a notation made every time that one of these is made. This is in the debt, the amount that will have to be paid. And of course, there's interest charged on this as well. Interest on everything. Meanwhile, because the individual was away with money that was given to him by the family firm director. The family firm director is also loaning money to the family to keep them afloat while this guy's away for 6 or 7 years. So there's a very substantial debt that the individual is going to have to pay when he comes back. Now, while he's away, he can make as much as 300% a year on the initial investment, as opposed to the 12 to 15% that he's accruing in debt on the initial loan, etc. Right? So it can be very profitable. But the fact that his wife and children are there is leverage to make sure that he comes back home when this is all over. These are caste-based family firms. In the event that he should act in a way that is unbecoming to the family, unbecoming to the community, his family can be disallowed to marry. His children won't be allowed to marry. His nuclear family can be held responsible. His father, his brothers can be held responsible for the amount, however much that he should abscond with if he takes off. And there are a couple of instances where we see that happen. It's exceptional, it doesn't usually happen. This is one of those kinds of things where there is a historical record. It's such a huge deal when one of these guys would decide, well, actually, I think I'm going to be Russian. I'm done with this. I'm convinced Orthodox Christianity is for me. No more Vishnu. I'm done with that. I'm going this direction. And then you get Russian colonial records that talk about this. Like, what do we do with this guy? Send him to the Spassky Monastery. That's what they say. See if he's really, willing to go the full distance and actually leave. And so you'll see records from this. Now, the flip side is, so here I've just presented an image of these meek women who are taking care of the children and, no doubt sweeping the floor and cooking. Quite often these guys came home and found that their family had gotten larger while they were away. And this is one of my favorite stories, and I've seen it a couple of different locations, that there was a tradition that these guys, before they would leave, would remove a pair of their pants, give it over to their wives, and if she should wish to become pregnant while he is away, all she had to do was put these pants on and walk around for a couple of days, and that was sufficient. And then the son, daughter, would be his, legally. See what I'm saying? Isn't that cool? Yeah. So there's a lot of colorful characters that we find in this message.
So I don't know if it is Valerie Hanson or someone else who said this in the book. Basically, they argue that we should call it Silk Road in Bullful instead of Silk Road. I just want, I don't have, I just feel like,
Yeah.
it might be just a debate
So Silk Road.
among scholars.
Yeah. It's a scholarly creation. And Valerie Hanson, I think, actually gives a really nice survey. She breaks a lot of items, and she demolishes some of this, this received wisdom, and I'm very appreciative of her work.
I was going to ask a similar question. It's obviously it's the Silk Road. It's obviously more than silk, and it's obviously
Right. Silk actually is, in
not a
certain
road.
theories it's important.
So what would you call it? What
I think-
what name do we use to replace? Because there's clearly something there.
Yeah.
It's been there for centuries.
Yeah, the Silk Road, the term was coined, I understand, in 1876, 1 year before Richthofen published, this idea of Der Siebenstraße. And he actually says Silk Road and Silk Roads in different places in his book, right? So it's complicated right there. Certainly there is no one Silk Road. There are many networks, overlapping networks. We can call them Silk Roads. Eurasian exchange would probably be the more precise. But, and here I will willingly admit, as a Central Asianist, I have two things. I have the Silk Road and I have Genghis Khan. I'm going to use both of them to full effect to bring students into my classrooms. But I will use it as an opportunity to instruct them in subtle nuances. Certainly Silk Roads is more precise than Silk Road, and Eurasian exchange would be more precise than Silk Roads. Silk Roads also, implies that there's a kind of a static network, right? You have several of them. Well, it's an ever-changing, pulsating, fluctuating web of exchange. And with much of this, we're dealing with pastoral nomads. There are no roads, right? They're just moving across pasture land. What's the road? It's a very problematic term, and I'll cling on to it.
Well, I'll ask the last question. I will allow myself the opportunity to ask the last question. Given the history that you've traced for us, I'm going to go back to this new Silk Road. Okay. So what will be the implications of this high-speed train? What do you see as the implications for Central Asia? What will this mean geopolitically, economically?
Geopolitically, there are two regions within Central Asia that stand to benefit the most. One is Kazakhstan, which is balancing a kind of tripartite political struggle in the region between Russia, they're very concerned with Russia, China, and the United States. And the United States is the lesser of the three. Encouraging Chinese interests in Kazakhstan is seen, in my perspective, it's seen in a very positive light in Chinese interests in the regions. The Kazakhs look at this very positively because they're desperately trying to avoid becoming the next Ukraine. The Chinese economy is substantial, it's growing, and China needs energy, Kazakhstan has energy. The flow of Chinese traffic through Kazakhstan brings resources and it also brings security. To a lesser extent, you could say the same about Uzbekistan, but it's really, it is unfortunate for Uzbek to a much lesser extent.
So that sounds like the beginnings of another Origins article on the current Silk Road, which would be excellent to see. You talk about that you need Genghis Khan and the Silk Road to be able to attract students. It'd be also another way to attract viewers, I think, to this presentation, which is being recorded and will be up on the Clio Society website, Clio, CLIO.osu.edu, where you can see this lecture and others in our series. So we'll be able to revisit this again. But for the moment, join me please in thanking